Hey everyone, welcome back to this podcast that we call the Geopods. Today, we're joined by the director of CPRC, that's called Covering China within the GEOSTRATA, Sumedh. And in this podcast, we'll be talking to him about what's really happening in the Russia Ukraine war. So, Sumedh, tell me this one thing, right? Given that there's a new war between Israel and Hamas, no one's like almost talking about Russia and Ukraine. So, what's happening in that war and how are things on ground? What do you think about?
First of all, thank you for this idea and really excited to discuss the war. With regards to your question that the war in Gaza has taken all the attention away from Ukraine, this is exactly the point that Zelensky made recently at the Davos summit in Switzerland. Uh, See, there are different threads to understand where the war is right now. When we look at the financial and the military support that Ukraine used to get from the West, now that has dried up. In America, it's a political season, it's an electoral season, so the Republicans are not allowing the Democrats to fund Ukraine because they don't think it's a very good investment. And they are linking it up with the border security measures in Mexico. So it's a roadblock. When we come to Brussels in EU has agreed to initiate formal talks about Ukraine's inclusion in the European Union. But there is no aid on the table right now because Hungary is blocking the aid. But we have just seen last week, Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, went to Kyiv and he announced a 2.5 million pound aid to Ukraine, which is kind of the biggest aid that the British government has given to Ukraine till date since the war has begun. Again, we saw in France there was a government change in the government. The new prime minister sent his foreign minister to Ukraine recently, and it is expected that the French president will visit Ukraine in February. So the West is in a hurdle right now. They are figuring out how to keep aiding Ukraine so that the Russians don't take the momentum on their side. When we talk about peace talks, we have seen that Putin has himself said that the war will go on until Ukraine talks. Ukraine can't talk because legally and constitutionally they have rejected any talks with Russia till President Putin is in power. It will be interesting to see because it is also a electoral season in Russia. President Putin is again fighting for presidency. We have seen how the Russian foreign minister has said that Ukraine is not sensible in negotiating right now. That is why the peace talks are not going ahead. We have seen the Ukrainian foreign minister himself say that no one can force us to negotiate with the Russians because they still believe that they can win on the ground with Western help. Another interesting fact is that Zelensky mentioned about sanctions. He said that if the Western countries would have been harsh, more harsh on including various other sectors while sanctioning Russia, these sanctions were half-hearted. If the Western countries would have initiated full sanctions on Russia, maybe the scenario would have been different. But these are all things that are rhetorics going around in the political arena. On the ground, as we have seen that there are various things that are happening. First of all, the Russians are annexing more territory in the east. We have seen Kupiansk, Kremina, Marinka axis. That's the axis in the east near Kharkiv. So the Russians are gaining more territory. The Russians are launching more missiles and drones into Ukraine. The Ukrainians, their logic is that the Russian air defense is more concentrated in the south to protect Crimea and in the east on the front lines. So they are targeting the Russian mainland. So like we have seen oil and gas depots and energy facilities being targeted in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, Moscow, everywhere. Belgorod. Recently, Belgorod was under fire as well. So on the battlefield, the Ukrainians are attacking the Russian territory. But again, this is a gray zone. The Russians told that if the Ukrainians attack Russia with the help of Western weapons, it would be war. But these drones are manufactured by Ukraine themselves, so it is not practically Western weapon. This is how it is going on politically, economically, and militarily.
Okay, let's do one thing. Let's hold this thought over there. And what I would inquire is let's just go deep within the Russia-Ukraine war. So while you said or you mentioned that the West is somehow figuring out that how to deal with Ukraine or the war, right? Because even in US, even though they've given what billions of dollars to Ukraine in aid, there's a lot of opposition within the country themselves, mainly from the Republican side that guys, how long are we really going to just keep pumping taxpayers billions of dollars into the economy, or let's just say from the economy to the war. And now that the elections are also coming in, so that might also have an effect. But let's just say, well, the West is figuring out how to sort of how much to give to aid and what sort of things to do. The thing is, initially, Mr. Putin, right, when the war started, or amidst or in the midst of the war, there was this time when Mr. Putin himself recorded, he came online and he asked, let's come on the table and let's negotiate whatever we have, right? So that was a time when the world saw this and they were like, and even Mr. Zelensky was like, oh, there's just no way, we're going to negotiate with Russia. And oh no, we're not going to be doing anything with them. Now is the time. So from Mr. Putin actually coming and implicitly or indirectly asking Ukraine to come on the negotiating table. Now we're on another time when Mr. Putin is like, the war can go long as you want, right? So what has really changed from then and now? How do you see we've the tables have turned?
See, first of all, to answer this question, we need to bifurcate, or we need to get in our head straight what were the stated objectives for Russia when they initiated the war. The Russians were never behind the Ukrainian territory. They are the largest country in the world. They don't need more territory. The game was about reshuffling or shifting NATO's uh, security architecture in Europe, making sure that this message that Russia is an important player when it comes to Europe's security is conveyed to the West. And you cannot uh, neglect Russia when you talk about European security. So Russia annexed more territory, which it did in 2014 as well. Crimea was annexed in 2014. Russia again came, Russia again annexed territories and showed that it has the capability to do aggression, and the West cannot really confront the Russians directly. Sorry. So this was the Russian aim at the beginning. Now, when with regards to the peace talks that you told, I remember it was in April 2022 that Putin came with this proposal of grand deal. So a grand deal for him was to renegotiate the security architecture of Europe in consultation with NATO, because the Russians do think that it does not reflect the current realities of geopolitics. NATO, the architecture of NATO. Another important thing was Arctic. Now, when you look at Europe and NATO and Russia, uh, it is just not till Europe. If you look at the map of Arctic, it is 50% Russia and 50% NATO countries. There are 8 countries. It is called Arctic 8. And it is basically about the continental shelf, if you know. This is a gray area in United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas. So you can claim area up to 200 nautical miles as your exclusive economic zone. But beyond 200 nautical miles, till 350 nautical miles, you need to scientifically prove that the continental shelf of your own territory is the same till 350 nautical miles. The Russians have proved this since 2007 scientifically. But because the Americans have not ratified UNCLOS, it is still a gray area because they are not ready to accept it. Because if they accept it, they would have to legitimize the Northern Sea route that runs through the Russian Arctic. So this is the entire deal he wanted. reshuffling the security architecture in Europe, and Arctic governance of Arctic. Because remember, Arctic is melting, and the resources beneath Arctic are very important for Russia to again become a economic power, and for US to make sure that the debt it has is effectively serviced with the economic opportunities generated out of the resources in the Arctic. So it's very complex for both of them. Neither of them have any scope for compromise here, and that is why they have been looking at this conflict as an existential threat right from the beginning. Now, with regards to why are they interested in talking right now, sorry, I think the Russians have done what they felt was necessary to do. Their plan after a few months was that they couldn't take majority of Ukraine. They couldn't take, say, Chernobyl or Kiev in the north. So what they did was they settled for four oblasts, as they say, provinces: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. They consolidated the region. They fortified the front line. Then they initiated a referendum. Then they initiated an election. Right now, you might be surprised to know that there are elected representatives from these four newly incorporated territories that are sitting in the Duma in Moscow. So they've done it. But now, what is the rationale that they are giving? The rationale that they are giving is this is based on right to self determination according to UN Charter. So this is again a gray zone in international law. And if you might have noticed, your United Nations Secretary General, he himself said that a peace has to be made on based on the UN Charter, which is again left to interpretation because the Russians have followed the due process of right to self-determination. They
Mm.
held a referendum, they held an election, and then there are elected representatives as well. But again, it's a gray zone in the international law. As far as the Americans are concerned, Donald Trump is saying that if he is elected to power, he will make sure that there's a settlement. But I don't think at the moment there's any talk going around between Ukraine, Russia, or either the Americans and the Russians.
Okay. So, the thing is, it just seems, given all of these things, right, the angle of the America, angle of Russia, or even let's just say Ukraine, is it going to be like a war that just never ends? Because let's look at how it started. It started with Mr. Putin saying it's a special military operation, and it's just going to be a thing of a few days, right? From few days, it translated into everyone was like, oh, it's going to be a month-long thing. And even if you look at the literature of war that was there, or the popular literature regarding war pre this conflict, people were talking about how the wars are going to be swift wars, right? Wars of cyber terrorism, hacking, internet wars. But when the war actually started, this war, unlike the popular belief of the time, has again turned into a long drawn conventional warfare, right? It's a very long drawn war, and people, although it might not be right as of now to compare it to, let's just say, the way the wars were fought in the World War II, but at least timeline wise, it's a very long drawn war. So, where are we going ahead with this, right? So what I want you to tell us is your, let's just say, prediction, because anything could happen, right? Who would have thought that the war would have come to this long? So, what's your prediction on how long the war might continue and how well it just might end? Or are we in a time where this war will just keep extending till, wherever or whenever? What do you think about that?
See, if the war has started, it will end. It is a butt of respect. But the fact that it has been converted into a stalemate shows that there's a parity between the American or the Western or the NATO military industrial complex and the Russian military industrial complex. Because there's no single weapon that has proven decisive on the battlefield. Even the delivery of F-16 is not guaranteed to provide the much needed relief to the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So there's parity on the ground, on the battlefield. Now, as far as the timeline is concerned, we have seen some different rhetoric coming out of Europe, and these are very scary rhetoric. We have seen Sweden's commander in chief and the defense minister himself. Sorry, both of them have told that Russia can use hybrid warfare. Russia can escalate. We have seen rhetorics coming out of the Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Recently, these republics again faced some kind of protest from the Russian population there, which is what happened in 2013 in Ukraine. Russian speaking people in Ukraine started protesting against the Ukrainian government, which gave the Russian government an excuse to escalate the situation. So that is another concern. Now, we have seen Germany. Our German defense minister has also said that you can expect Russia to escalate and attack NATO territory within 5 to 8 years. And we have also seen this kind of a comment from NATO's military commission chief. He himself said that Europeans have to get ready for a war. So, of course, the general acceptance in the military elite in Europe, in the West, is that if Russia is not defeated in this war, so sorry, again, it was the narrative that they used initially in the war, impose a strategic defeat on Russia so that it does not get up again. If that is not done, today or tomorrow, Russia will escalate, or conditions will become such that the West would have to preemptively escalate. So this is a long drawn war.
Mm. Mm.
And the fact proves that there's a parity. There's nothing that the Americans have or the Russians have
Mm.
that can prove decisive. There's parity.
Okay. And if that's the thing, right? Uh, Even though the war is between Russia and Ukraine, America is just as big of a factor as just the two of them, right? It will not be because again, Ukraine is being sustained mainly by the American aid. If that's the thing, right? How do you see the American elections playing out when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine warfare? Because now elections are just about the corner, right? And so, in what way the elections will affect the outcomes of the war? What do you have to say on that?
See, right now I'm not following the individual stance of all the candidates that are running.
Mm.
But a general conception is that the Republicans are not in favor of continuing this war till eternity.
Mhm.
It was a war that the Democrats chose,
Mhm.
and they could fund this war till now.
Mhm.
But now the Republicans have lost interest and they're linking it up with border security in Mexico, as
Mhm.
we discussed. So, definitely, I mean, if I was in Kremlin right now and if I
Mhm.
would see what is happening in US right now, with
Mhm.
all the political disillusionment that is going around in the youth,
Mhm.
this political disillusionment was the factor that led to Capitol riot on June the 6th in
Mhm.
2020,
Mhm.
2021. Sorry. So, if I was a Russian right now and looking at the American election, it would be a very good feeling for me because if America is distracted from within,
Mhm.
it is good that it won't ramp up security aid for Ukraine. But
Mhm.
again, if I'm a Russian, I have uh, inherently invoked a sense of threat in the European capital.
Mhm.
So regardless of who wins American election, it will be a factor. But right now, I need to get my stuff sorted with the Europeans as well. If
Mhm.
I'm Russian right now, so American elections are a big factor, but
Mhm.
I don't think it will be the decisive factor. The American foreign policy elites, the blob, as they say, they
Mhm.
won't give up on Ukraine.
Mhm.
Right now, they are trying just to explore different opportunities. As I said, if America does not step up, will Europe step up? Will UK step up? Will
Mhm.
Germany or will France step up? They're just trying to explore these opportunities.
Okay, you talked about Europe, right? And even though, whenever we talk about the war, it's usually either Russia or Ukraine, or it's America, right? But when the war started, all of the worries were not centered around America. They were centered around Europe because everyone was like, how is Europe going to buy the energy, the inflation going there? And now, if you look at Europe, there are like multiple sort of protests happening. Be it the farmers that are doing it in France, or like the general people who are doing it in the UK or anything. So, if that's the case, how do you see has the war impacted Europe, and what is Europe actually thinking? Because UK has initially stepped up, right, with the aid, but not the EU per se. So where is EU going? Where is UK going? And how is Europe? How has the war impacted Europe? Number one, and the thing is, how is Europe reacting to it presently?
See, there are different narratives coming out of Europe as well. We have seen Slovakian Prime Minister say that, at the end of the day, Ukraine will have to seize its territory as a compromise.
Mm-hmm.
We won't get involved with Russia just because Ukraine does not want to give away its territory.
Mm-hmm.
This is exactly what Hungary has been saying.
Mm-hmm.
So there are internal divisions within Europe, but there's a consensus among all the European capitals that we cannot uh, not talk with the Russians. We have to talk with the Russians, and
Mm-hmm.
that is the only way to bring peace on the European continent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, there are internal divisions because some people are saying that we don't need Americans to guard us, which is again what they are talking about EU's strategic autonomy
Mm-hmm.
or European army.
Mm-hmm.
Some are still in the favor that the entire NATO military industrial complex that has been set up
Mm-hmm.
is well established to defend Western interests in case of an escalation with the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
So there are internal divisions within the EU, but there is also a concession that you need to end the war by talking it out with the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
No military solution is possible in this scenario. Also, we have seen, see, EU has suffered more than the America.
Mm-hmm.
America is the one who is driving Ukrainian policies against in the war.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. But it has been the European capitals that have been impacted by the flow of migrants into their countries, the
Mm-hmm.
Ukrainian refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So it has disturbed the economy. Again, if we look at the grain deal example,
Mm-hmm.
so the grain deal fell out, and so Ukraine could not ship its grain. So what it did, it started sending its grains to Poland,
Mm-hmm.
to the Baltic Sea, and then from the Baltic Sea to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
It added cost. And again, as you said, farmer protests. These farmer protests have been in France, Germany. It was also observed in Poland because the Polish farmers were of the opinion that Ukrainian food grains are very cheap in
Mm-hmm.
comparison to their own domestic product. So this has impacted various countries in Europe economically as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, if let's just say, America is divided, let's just say, on how to react. Europe is divided. Now, how is Ukraine actually looking at, like, America and Europe? Because initially there were talks of them being included into the NATO or even in the EU. Like, we all remember Mr. Zelensky being so excited about, joining these blocs. Now, are they even anywhere close to, be joining any of these blocs? And how are they looking at the America and the Europe? Is the feeling like, oh, you guys, brought us to the war, you guys supported initially, now you guys are sort of backtracking? Or are they still, looking at the West, be it the America or Europe, with hopeful eyes? What's happening? Like, how is Ukraine looking at them?
They are hopeful. They are hopeful of the fact that they can play the West because there are different sections in the West.
Hmm.
See, the Western European countries are not very ready to antagonize the Russians to
Hmm.
the level of a strategic defeat,
Hmm.
like France, Spain. But the Central European countries are reluctant,
Hmm.
whereas the Eastern European countries like Poland and the Baltic countries
Hmm.
are very much agreed to the fact that if Russia is not stopped,
Hmm.
it will impact their own countries as well. So they think that Ukraine is the shield for Europe right
mm,
So Ukraine is playing the West according to their own different policies. They have
mm,
a different policy for the US. They have a
mm,
different policy for, let's just say, NATO allies or NATO plus allies like Japan, Canada, Australia that
mm,
can help us, but we can't rely on them completely. They have different policies for France and Germany and Italy as well.
mm,
They have different policies for Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia.
mm,
So this is how they have different policies for Bulgaria and Romania as well, because again, their entire access to Black Sea is connected to Bulgaria and Romania.
mm,
Otherwise, Russia has already placed a lot of naval infrastructure to block the Black Sea. So they
mm,
have different policies for different countries, region-wise within Europe.
mm,
But the bigger picture is that they still think that Western aid can help them reverse the changes on the battlefield and gain back their own territory, which
mm,
is around 110,000 square kilometer at this moment. It's very tough to get this territory back when Russia has already placed provincial administration
mm.
in these territories. There's a defense police that is being made uh, to guard these territories. The front line is open, but much more consolidated on the Russian side than the
Mm.
Ukrainian side.
All right.
So they are hopeful.
Okay, if they are still hopeful when they look at the West, I mean, I don't think so. They have any other option of, let's just say, going unhopeful, right? If I have to speak from the standards of real politics. Now, the last thing is for this podcast, what we've seen America, we've seen Europe, we've seen even Ukraine and Russia. Let's come on to China, right? And with that, let's sort of end this podcast, right? Initially, when the war began, right? Just 1 month prior, uh, there was this deal or announcement, right, between Russia and China, proclaiming the depths and the heights of the relationship. And everyone thought that, the war was some sort of China's backing. Where is China, or how does China look at the war as of now? I remember the covering China covering Mr. Xi Jinping's, 10-point program that he came up with to resolve the war. So is China even playing a part in this war? Is it not playing a part in? So what's happening? How is China looking at the war? And with that, I think we will be ending this podcast. So what do you think about that?
See, China, as you said, they proclaimed the friendship without limits agreement just like days before the invasion. Since then, China has supported Russia,
Mm,
evade sanctions. It has acted as a conduit country
mm,
and helped the Russian military industrial complex, because these guys, the Russians and the Chinese, have very strong military technical cooperation, as they claim.
mm,
Uh, sorry. Then the second fact is that at the on the first anniversary of the invasion, on
mm,
21st Feb 2023, the
mm,
Chinese launched their peace formula. It was a 12-point formula
mhm,
in which indirectly they were supporting uh, the adherence to international law
mm,
in a way that could help them build their narrative around Taiwan.
mm,
So whatever China has been doing with regards to this war, it has an eye always kept on the fact that when push comes to shove,
mm,
and it is forced to do something on Taiwan, what will be the international reaction? So
mm,
it is playing very wisely. Recently, we have seen in Davos that Ukrainian President Zelensky wanted a meeting with the Chinese premier, but the Chinese did not agree on the meeting. So the Ukrainians and the Chinese did not meet. In a way, sorry, in a way, China is not appeasing the Ukrainian side because
mm,
it does not want to jeopardize its relations with Moscow.
mm.
But it stands firmly on the regular narrative that cessation of violence, ceasefire, and stuff. But it is actively helping the Russian military-industrial complex, not only with technology but also to evade sanctions.
All
So it
right.
has chosen its side.
Okay. So I guess with that, we'll be concluding this podcast, and let's just try and see, where does the war actually go? And yeah, I mean, we'll see you or Sumedh in the next podcast, right, Sumedh? Do you have
Thank you.
anything at the end? Any, fancy prediction on the war?
I am guessing that this is only leading to the Third World War.
Hmm.
That
Third.
is because we have seen the NATO has mobilized 90,000 troops right now.
Hmm.
They are carrying out the biggest exercise since Cold
Hmm.
War. And the NATO officials, the Western officials are saying that Russia may escalate.
Hmm.
So it will be a bigger if
Okay.
there's no solution inside.
Okay. I would rather, hedge my bets on there not being another world war. But let's see what happens in at GeoStrata or at Geopods. We'll be covering how geopolitics turns out. So have a wonderful day ahead, Sumit, and thanks for everyone
Thank
for
you for
staying.
inviting me.
And you may let us know about your views in the comments. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next episode.